So I think that many of you know that David and I met on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land in the spring of 2010. And I just remembered that I'm supposed to tell you something. He is not here this morning because our dog had eye surgery on Wednesday, and he is worried about leaving him home alone. He has heard this sermon and approves of this message. He wanted you to know that. So anyway, he and I met on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land in the spring of 2010. It was my first pilgrimage and my first trip to Israel. It was David's fourth. I'd come out of a very difficult relationship. And David's first wife, they were high school sweethearts and married for 42 years, had died 1 year before that trip. From the moment David and I met at Dulles Airport, some of you know tacos and guacamole were involved, I was really drawn to him. David had kind eyes, and I just immediately sensed that he had a very generous heart. So we arrived in Israel, and we began to follow the footsteps of Jesus, and David and I began to spend more and more time together. Every day we would visit holy sites, and our pilgrimage leader would instruct us to go off by ourselves and reflect quietly on the lessons that we were hearing. Well, David and I would go off by ourselves together, and during that quiet reflection time, we would share how we heard God speaking to us in this moment. Friendship grew between us as we shared our stories and our ministry experiences, and as we reflected on each of those holy places. Well, at some point I realized that I was developing feelings for David, which was profoundly confusing to me for reasons that I'll explain. There is nothing about our situation that makes any sense in any way. David was an evangelical pastor. I had been dating women for the past 20 years, and I was an Episcopal priest. The evangelical pastors in the town where I was serving would not speak to me, nor would they come to any ecumenical event in which I was a participant. David is 20 years older than I am. Nothing about this made sense inside my brain, inside my heart, or as it turns out in his. I could not make any sense of my feelings or see how what was happening between us had any future. Well, it turns out that David was also developing feelings for me and was equally confused. He was a rare and open and affirming evangelical pastor, so that wasn't the problem. But he thought I might not be interested in him. Now, eventually, I had the courage to name my feelings, and thanks be to God, here we are 16 years later. Now, you are probably wondering why I am telling you this story and what it has to do with today's readings. It was walking the road to Emmaus that changed everything for me. Let me tell that story. Now, it is true that scholars aren't really sure what village Luke meant when he wrote that Cleopas and his companion left Jerusalem and walked to Emmaus. Ancient maps don't show any towns by that name, but over the 2,000 years since this story, scholars have made educated guesses. On the last day of our pilgrimage in 2010, our group hiked one of the options for the Emmaus Road. And for those of us who went on pilgrimage to the Holy Land in 2023, it was a different road to Emmaus than the one that we followed when we went to Israel, because there are multiple choices. Now, before we set out, our pilgrimage leader gathered us in a group and read this gospel passage to us. And then he invited us to notice that all of the action in the story takes place in a series of questions and answers. The stranger who will later turn out to be Jesus and Cleopas and his companion continue to ask and answer questions from one another as they walk along the way. Listen. As two disciples walked along the road on that evening of that first Easter day, they talked among themselves about all that had happened. Jesus joins them on the road, but Luke says they were kept from recognizing him. Jesus asks the first question, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" Cleopas responds with a question of his own. Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days? Well, apparently, among a certain crowd of people, the news spread quickly. Cleopas is surprised that Jesus has no idea what's going on. Jesus confirms his supposed ignorance. What things? So the companions answer. In their answer, they expressed all the sorrow and confusion and hope that they felt about everything that had transpired. They told of how they believed that their teacher Jesus was a mighty and powerful prophet, how the chief priests and leaders, threatened by that same power, handed him over to death, and Rome crucified him. They shared their hopes for how Jesus might have redeemed Israel, and their disappointment at his death and what that might mean for them. And they shared their amazement at how that very morning, the women in their group found his tomb empty, and the angels told of his resurrection. I wonder how Jesus kept a straight face, y'all. He responds to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared." Another question. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory? And then he taught them, using all of the Hebrew scriptures, about himself and his ministry. When they came near to the village of Emmaus, Jesus made to carry on, but the companions invited him to stay the night. When they sat down to eat, Jesus took the bread, he broke it, and he blessed it. And I want you to notice that those are the same actions that we use every single Sunday when we celebrate the Eucharist at this altar. In a few minutes, Will take the bread, he will break it, and he will bless it. But it was in that moment when Jesus did those things that Cleopas and his companion recognized Jesus. And just like that, he was gone. There is a final question which they ask of one another. It feels more rhetorical. Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us? In hindsight, they realized that something was different about that conversation. They immediately got up from their table and rushed those 7 miles back to Jerusalem to tell the others. And it's there that they learn that the disciples have come to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead because he appeared to Simon Peter. The story ends with the companions telling their whole story all over again. Luke writes, "They told what had happened on the road and how he had been known to them in the breaking of the bread." So back to March 2010. We gathered on one of the possible roads to Emmaus, and we heard that story. Our retreat leader pointed out to us how the narrative moved through questions, and then he invited us to walk slowly on this hiking trail with space between each person. He instructed us to talk to Jesus. I will never forget his words. He said, "Ask Jesus your questions and listen for the answers. Listen for Jesus' questions to you and answer them honestly. Like those disciples on this road all those years ago, be in dialogue with Jesus as you walk." For once, David and I listened and did not talk to each other. And as soon as I began to walk, I laid out all of my confused feelings, how unexpected they were and how strange it felt. I might have said, "What the heck is going on here?" I shared my sorrow that we would soon be returning to the States about 36 hours from then, and that David would return to his home in Reston, and I was headed back to northern New Hampshire. And then I did something that y'all will recognize as generally really hard for me. I stopped talking. It's true. I actually did it. I did not expect what happened next. For the first time in my life, I actually heard Jesus' voice. Jesus told me not to worry. He told me that everything would work out, that David and I would marry, and that we would spend the rest of our lives together. He told me not to feel sad and not to panic. I was flabbergasted. And yet, in that moment, every fear and anxiety and worry I'd been feeling just vanished in an instant. And while I wouldn't know that those words were true for a while, they were. Because look, here we are, 16 years later. Friends, I can tell you that nothing like this had ever happened to me before, and it hasn't happened since. On the other hand, again, not a great surprise, I'm not really terrific about getting quiet when I pray. It will not shock you to hear that I'm as extroverted in my prayers as I am in the rest of my life. But when I hear this story, it reminds me to shut up, to stop talking, and to listen. And when I'm wrestling with something, I try to remember that moment on the Emmaus Road and to pause. Not always great at it, but I try. Try to ask questions, to stop talking, to listen. So I want to end today by inviting you to take a mini journey on the road to Emmaus. You don't have to leave your seat. I'm going to set a timer for 3 minutes. And I want you to close your eyes if that feels comfortable to you. You might want to imagine a place that feels safe for you. You might want to imagine a place that's beautiful and green, because that's what that road was like that day. I want to invite you to get quiet. If there's something that you're wrestling with, ask Jesus about it. Ask Jesus a question. Listen for an answer. You might hear a voice like I did that day. You might not. You might feel peace. Truth, in this moment, you might not feel anything at all. You may not hear an answer for days or weeks or months. That is all okay. The point in this moment is to be quiet with Jesus. So right now, I invite you on a journey on the Emmaus Road for just a few minutes to be with Jesus. See if your heart burns. 3 minutes starting now. It's only buzzing, but that was 3 minutes. Amen.